Thanks very much to that first panel for a great opening discussion. I thought you did a great job of really framing the issues in a broad sense for the more detailed panels that we'll then dive into. Later today, we'll have panels that will be talking about state, tribal, local governments, including some case studies. But for now, for this panel, we want to focus on the role of industry and on civil society and how they oftentimes work together with governments or on their own to try to drive solutions to these issues of global change that we've talked about. Last night we talked about, and Huguette alluded to what an important year 2015 will be. We have the climate change talks that will culminate in the Paris COP in November. What we're hearing is there's going to be a lot of voluntary asks of various stakeholders in terms of trying to meet whatever goals are set by those climate talks. We have the UN developing the Sustainable Development Goals to replace the Millennium Development Goals. We're hearing that voluntary contributions by industry and civil society are now going to be factored very heavily in by the UN in terms of their thinking about how those new goals will be met. So increasingly, our global institutions are admitting that the frameworks that we have in place right now are not achieving these goals, are not getting the job done, and that we do need to look for bottom-up type solutions. And a big part of that are what we call voluntary initiatives, groups of private and public participants getting together to try to drive change on a particular issue or a set of issues. And that's what we want to drill down and talk about today in this panel. And we've got three great panelists in which to have that conversation. The first is Elaine Dorward-King. Elaine is the Executive Vice President of Sustainability and External Relations at Newmont Mining Corporation based here in Denver. She's had a very long career in the mining industry and has been involved with a lot of voluntary initiatives that are addressing or attempting to address issues of sustainability. Andy Spielman is a partner and the co-head of the Energy and Natural Resources Group at the law firm of Hogan Lovells. He's based in Denver. He represents a number of clients who are in the energy space, particularly the renewable energy space. He's also appearing today with a government hat on as well. He is the chair of the Colorado Regional Air Quality Council and the vice chair of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So Governor Hickenlooper has appointed him to two very important positions in terms of sustainability, air quality, energy policy in the state. And finally, John Drexage, we're very lucky to have visiting from Ottawa, Ontario. Currently, he's a senior fellow with the International Institute of Sustainable Development. He's got a long career in government with NGOs and as an advisor to industry. He's been tracking the climate talks and the UN's development of Sustainable Development Goals very closely. He'll have a lot to report or to talk to us about those two processes as well. So with that, we're also going to offer each of our three panelists the chance to just make some opening remarks to try to frame the issue from their perspective, and then we'll get into a little more detail, and we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So Elaine, maybe you could start us out and make some introductory comments.
All right,
Thanks.
I will, and I'll do my best to stick to the 5 minutes so we have plenty of time for questions. I wanted to spend a little time today talking about voluntary initiatives from a corporate point of view and talk about why companies would choose to develop or engage in voluntary initiatives and what are the benefits, why would they do that, and talk a little bit about some of them that have been successful and in some cases absolutely pivotal in changing the behaviors and practices of business over time. Well, there are a couple of reasons that companies would choose to do such a thing. One is to try to achieve a competitive advantage, to move ahead of competitors in the field by trying to do something different that allows them to differentiate themselves. Another reason would be to address an emerging risk, some kind of a threat that they see coming down the pipe that they want to get in front of and want to do that in a way that maybe is collaborative within their industry. And the third reason would be to engage in a multi-stakeholder dialogue to try and solve problems that are common, that people in different sectors besides the industry themselves might see as important to work together to try to solve. So there are a couple of drivers there, and they're not mutually exclusive, in fact. Often multi-stakeholder approaches are the best way to address emerging risk for a corporate. An example of a competitive advantage initiative that the industry has worked on over a number of years is the Business for Biodiversity Offset program. And if we have time to talk about that a little later, it's a very interesting concept that over the past probably 15 years, in fact, business worked with academia to understand how to protect biodiversity in a way that was both effective but business friendly. And there have been some successes but some challenges with that as well. One of the other areas that I mentioned was trying to manage risk and trying to make sure that your business is able to continue. And that means perhaps there's a regulation coming down the pike that may not be implemented in a way that business sees as pragmatic, and they want to get ahead of that, or they want to try and engage and manage their business better to prevent policies that might be detrimental to the company. And an example of that is the International Cyanide Management Code, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, because that's a really important thing that a lot of people don't know anything about. Another example of that would be local content practices, where businesses try to source both services and supplies locally wherever they do business. And that has evolved over the past decade as well in a very interesting way, but started out as a corporate initiative to try and manage risk and be a good citizen. And finally, there are voluntary initiatives that bring people together to talk about issues and problems and solve problems. And one of the fantastic examples of a collaborative process that has worked toward credible outcomes is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which Hujet talked about earlier this morning, so I won't talk about that anymore. But if I quickly run through the International Cyanide Management Code as an example of an industry-sponsored initiative that now has real teeth, not just in the U.S., but globally. And it was sparked by a need, by the recognition that cyanide possibly wasn't being managed as well or consistently as it needed to be. One of the examples was right here in Colorado in 1992. Some of you might remember the Summitville mine cyanide leaks, where cyanide entered the headwaters of the Alamosa River. In 1995, there was a dramatic tailings dam failure in Guyana, the Omai tailings dam failure. There was a significant event that most of you probably will remember in 2000, the Baimar tailings dam failure in Romania, where cyanide entered the Danube River and ended up flowing through. There was contamination that flowed through 6 European countries. So there's some examples of material not being managed in a consistent way that could threaten the legitimate and safe use of that material, particularly in the mining industry. So the International Cyanide Management Code was developed by a multi-stakeholder group, a multi-sectoral group that was brought together by the UN Environmental Program, UNEP, and the predecessor to ICMM, which is the International Council for Metals and Mining, ICME, in response to those incidents. And in 2005, the 14 original signatory companies promulgated that standard, and in fact, the institute that manages that, there's an independent cyanide management institute, was created. Now, the code is administered by that independent institute and a board of directors, and it's funded by the gold mining industry, cyanide manufacturers, and cyanide producers. There's a code of practice with regard to performance criteria, both for the mining industry, the transport industry, and the producers. And industries that sign up to the code are audited by an independent third-party auditor that has to be approved by the Cyanide Management Institute. Every business has to be audited every 3 years, and that means every facility, not every company, every facility in those companies. The code was designed to bring good practice around worker safety, environmental protection, and community protection. And now, today, there are 41 mining companies, 11 cyanide manufacturers, and 105 cyanide transporters that are signatory to the code. So in that period of time, a decade, from 14 to, I didn't add them up ahead of time, I should have, about 160 some odd corporations, some very large, are signatories to the code, undergo those audits, and practice to the standards there. That has expanded in such a way that it's now being written into regulatory requirements, financing requirements for new projects, mining projects around the world. The IFC has a requirement for the cyanide code that they require businesses adhere to before they'll fund a new gold mining project. It's contained directly in their environmental health and safety guidelines. Likewise, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development require compliance with the code. So I'm over 5 minutes, but it's an excellent example of something that was created from a need voluntarily that has had success in changing performance that's now becoming a requirement for industry going forward. And I think it fits with the panel conversation that we're having today. So I'll start.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks very much. Andy.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, well, thank you very much for letting me join you and share some of your valuable time this morning. It's really a pleasure to be here. Britt, thank you for the invitation. And to my panelists, honor to be up here with you. I hope this will be useful to you. I'll share my thoughts with, again, as Britt said, a few different hats on. I'm an attorney in private practice. I help manage our energy and natural resources practice around the world. I have my own law practice and clients that I assist. I also have these volunteer jobs Britt mentioned. I have the honor of serving the state of Colorado as on the Regional Air Quality Council as its chairman for 8 years. In fact, Governor Ritter appointed me his first few months in office, and that's a nice way of saying I've probably been in that office or that position too long, but I've had the honor of working with some very talented people to solve nothing less important than try to address the air quality issues outside this building, outside my home, and probably most of yours. I also serve as the vice chair of the Oil and Gas Commission, and that's been a fairly heady assignment the past 4 years. These are very important issues we're dealing with, as emotional and personal, I think, as you know, I've seen in 25 years of this kind of work. Let me just put a little context so you'll get a little bit of where my head is coming from, where my head is. You know, first of all, let me say the views I share today are not those of the law firm of Hogan Lovells, the Hickenlooper administration, the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, or the Regional Air Quality Council. They're really just Andes. But we all develop our thoughts based on our experiences. So these are mine. Colorado really, in my mind, its history is a natural resource economy. That has changed. While natural resources remain tremendously important to jobs and how we and our neighbors make our living, we have aerospace, we have life sciences and healthcare, we have resort operation, recreation, hospitality, light industry at some places, some manufacturing now more than we used to have. But our history, I would put out there, and some may disagree, really was natural resource based. The mining companies, the water delivery systems, the early roads and railroads were developed for a natural resource based economy in this part of the world, whether it was cattle or minerals development. So Now, fast forward to 2015. Well, let me back up and just give you a few quick statistics. Colorado now is 5th in the nation in natural gas production. We have part of 7 of the 30 largest gas fields are in our state. We have oil production. This may have changed in the past 3 weeks, but it has been at a 57-year high, where our state is producing about 2% of U.S. domestic production. That's about right. There's 50 states. We were the 7th largest coal producing state in the country in 2011. In 2014, that number dropped 17%. So we are still a coal producing state, but not 7th largest anymore. On the renewable side, we've skyrocketed. We were nowhere near the top 10 in wind or solar when I got into this business. We're 9th in the U.S. now for wind and 5th for solar. So why throw out these statistics? We've got a robust energy development economy in our state that brings certain environmental issues to the forefront, and those can be dealt with, and frankly are dealt with, as I hope we'll talk about in the Q&A, with some combination of regulatory, that is required, mandated actions, and a series of voluntary programs where we think stakeholders and citizens can take certain actions, and that will help us to achieve the policy goals or the required standards that we want and need to obtain. So a pretty exciting time, frankly. Later, if we want, we can talk about what we have done at the Oil and Gas Commission in the past few years, how we've taken both voluntary and mandatory requirement steps or have built regulations based on best practices we've seen come from a voluntary nature, why we think there are already immediate benefits to the public in access to information, ability to assess the environment, and make one's own determinations of safety issues, why enforcement is out there and alive and well in our state where regulatory requirements are not being met. And we can talk later, if people are interested, in the Environmental Protection Agency's new requirements at a federal level that will, there will be more stringent air quality requirements governing VOCs and NOx that affect every one of our communities, and we can talk about what those are. But the long and the short of it is communities in this state and across the country that are currently in compliance with federal air quality standards for ground level ozone will not be very shortly. And within a matter of 1, 2, 3 years, each community in each state will have to submit to the federal government plans to attain these new standards. And I can guarantee you in this state it will be a mix of voluntary and required or regulatory actions that are proposed. I just want to say hi to my very good friend from EPA, Ian Schmidt, who's sitting back there. And a long time ago when President Clinton was president, she taught me a lot of what I know about voluntary programs when I was the pinhead bureaucrat in Washington, and she was the one in the real world who was showing us how things were getting done. Hi, Ian. Nice to see you. So that's, I think a fascinating topic, one I'm thrilled to be a part of the dialogue, and I guess I'll leave it there, Britt, and wait for opportunity to interact with my co-panelists on Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sandy. John.
Well, Britt, thanks very much. And interesting how you talked about Colorado's economic history. I had a bit of time yesterday afternoon and decided to take a drive outside of Boulder and found myself on this very, very interesting little road called the Virginia Canyon Road that took me down and all through the history of Colorado's economy, the closed down mining establishments throughout the canyon, et cetera, and it really brought home to me just how Colorado was built. And not at all dissimilar from, in fact, how my home province, Alberta, was also very much built, and where natural resources continue to play a very strong role. And I think one of the real challenges that we face is that if we can't get it right in Colorado or Alberta, where we have capital and we have capacity in terms of addressing issues like climate change effectively and other global pressures that the panelists referred to before, if we can't get it right, how in heaven's name can we expect major developing economies to start getting it right as well? And so I think there's often a tendency to think internally in an insular manner in terms of the challenges that you're facing, the competitiveness issues, if you go too far ahead, et cetera, But the fact is that we're very much an example of how it can or should be done. We've been unfortunate examples in a lot of other different respects. When you look at the typical paradigm of development, it's the car. And it doesn't matter that you're in Bangkok and you can't get around anywhere for the life of you because there's such a high consumption rate of the car vehicle. That's based on the North American model of post-World War II urban development. And that's still the ideal model that essentially we have in place throughout the world. And it's that paradigm that slowly but surely needs to be shifting. And we see it shifting, but it takes an awful lot of effort. And that's where I think the voluntary initiatives and the voluntary practices are playing and continue to play a massive kind of role. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of different initiatives. I am a vice chair and will actually take over as chair of the Verified Carbon Standard, which has developed all sorts of exciting methodologies around how one can take accounting and develop standards for reduced emissions from deforestation and land degradation. We've developed standard practices, or I would say standard-based approaches on offsets. We've also developed sustainable land management practices and looked at ways in which we could actually augment certified greenhouse gas emission credits with sustainability tags that speak to, in fact, how it's complementing community priorities, how it's complementing biodiversity priorities, etc. Also have the privilege of working as a senior fellow with a recently established carbon co-op that was just set up in Quebec. And so we have financing from a number of the Quebec's major financial institutions and pension funds, where we work with the major fuel distributors. And just to remind everyone, California's cap is also very much Quebec's cap. It is a Quebec-California cap and trade that's going on in North America right now. Fuel distributors were capped as of January 1st. We've entered into a number of contracts with a number of the fuel distributors to help them find reductions that will help lessen the price of the acquisition of auction credits that they're looking for. And so finding all kinds of very interesting opportunities with the small and medium enterprise market in Quebec, and looking forward to actually the expansion of the cap and trade system in other jurisdictions. There was some mention in the Governor Ritter that talked about the Western collaboration. I was fortunate enough in my days when I was Director of Climate Change and Energy to be part of the West Climate Initiative, which actually, the result being the California and Quebec cap and trade system. And it was absolutely fascinating to see this discussion that went on between Quebec, Ontario, which are in eastern Canada, I'm sure all of you are aware, along with British Columbia, in a collaboration with Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, California, and I'm forgetting one state, Montana. It wasn't Colorado, interestingly enough. And from there now, we've seen another morphing into a thing called a Pacific Coast Collaboration, where you have British Columbia now collaborating with Oregon, Washington, and California in addressing ways in which they may become more proactive on addressing climate change. In the East Coast, you have a similar regional bloc going on between the Maritime provinces of Canada and New England states, the same kind of initiatives. So what's so interesting is how the lack of federal leadership of one sort or another in both Canada and the United States, there's almost like a physics law of filling the vacuum. And it's been, when I was involved as a negotiator in the Canadian government in the days of Kyoto, it was all forcing the provinces to come to the table and saying, we're here, you've got to come in and you've got to own up. And they were fighting like, they were fighting like hell in not doing so. The dynamic now has completely changed because of that vacuum that was created, and these regional initiatives have played an enormous role in the development in North America of effective regulatory and pricing and greenhouse gas pricing signals. Just very quickly onto you mentioned, Brett, and I am fortunate that with my work, that I'm able to have a foot both within the negotiations on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, so the Paris talks coming up, as well as the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. And we talked about how everything is interconnected. I think you mentioned that this morning. What's so amazing about those two processes is that I think the SDG process is very much aware of climate change. Climate change is not aware of anything around the broader issues around sustainability. And that, for me, is a huge problem. There needs to be a more effective recognition within the climate community that we have to effectively address the broader sustainability agenda that deals with things like effective employment, youth values, making sure that the youth between 18 and 25 are effectively employed, right? You have issues also relating to governance, et cetera. So two fascinating processes, but one thing to keep in mind is that these frameworks themselves are also voluntary. So the final agreement that we're going to get in Paris is going to be nothing like Kyoto. It's going to be entirely bottom-up, where the countries, what are they developing? They're not developing targets. You know what the actual term is? INDC, and that means indicative nationally determined contributions. That's going to be the characterization of what each country is going to be offering. So I think one has to understand that even in the development of these global frameworks, we are not looking any longer at the days of some kind of a top-down with legal consequences for not meeting those targets. That clearly did not work effectively using that model under Kyoto. Canada was the one country that wasn't going to meet it, so they decided, well, we'll opt out, and that was it. So instead, they're trying to develop a much more bottom-up kind of a dynamic, which will hopefully bring everyone in the tent, but to many people's minds, and it'd be interesting to hear the legal opinions here, effectively lacking in stringency to really actually have this with any kind of effective teeth. And that's part of the problem that we have here. But I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thanks, John. All right, well, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative, just as Sarah did, and ask one question for each panelist. Then we'll throw it out to the open to the audience. So please be thinking about what your questions are. Elaine, I guess going back to the industry perspective on these voluntary initiatives, I guess one question that is sort of out there is this concept of the risk of greenwashing, that in some cases these initiatives just sort of become a front for a PR campaign, or they're sort of a way for people to, burnish their reputation, but because of the lack of enforceability or the lack of clarity on the standards or whatever, they're really not driving performance. They're just sort of being used, for this greenwashing effect. So can you comment on that criticism and maybe talk about some of the things you think about in terms of combating that fear, that suspicion among certain segments of the population?
It's an interesting thing. I hear that sometimes, and I wonder about is it sometimes the industry doesn't explain well enough what we actually are doing, and try to bridge that gap of trust that exists with regard to corporations and what they do. I think of greenwash usually used in terms of companies' philanthropic activities, what people still call corporate social responsibility, which often is not about, I believe, improving performance on the ground where it really matters, but about contributing and donating financially to things that make a company look good or feel good, or doing things that are employee related and not as impactful in terms of the business. But so how do you make sure that initiatives like what I talked about, the cyanide code and other things, are actually changing performance or driving leadership performance? And I think a good bit of that comes from transparency, that if you are sincere about changing what you are doing and about the standards that you have in place, then you're willing to let people come and look, let people see your operations, see what you're doing. And in the case of formalized programs like the cyanide code, or there are other examples of that, you have independent third-party auditors come in and audit against those standards, and the results are public. And with that particular example of the cyanide code, or ISO 14001 environmental management system would be another example of something companies take on voluntarily. If you don't satisfy those third-party auditors, you're thrown out and you no longer have that certification. And increasingly, not enough, but increasingly, investors and others that look at companies look at those kinds of things as indicative of a well-managed company and a company that they want to invest in. From my point of view, I wish more investors would ask questions about that. You know, rather than just focusing on financial metrics, that they would ask more questions about our environmental performance or our community performance and how we're seeking to manage those risks and engage with other people. But maybe we'll get there. I hope so.
Great, thanks. Andy, I'd like to take you up on your offer to maybe share a little bit more of your thinking about this whole 111D process and how you sort of see it evolving. You know, how do you see the road ahead as Colorado, as one state, is going to come up with this plan that then gets integrated into the larger 50-state plan that then gets integrated into the non-binding commitment that the U.S. will make at the Paris COP, as John just alluded to. When you look ahead at what the EPA or the Colorado has in store for addressing the new EPA rule, what do you see?
Well, it's a great question, and it's one I'm still learning about as well. In fact, I'm learning from Governor Ritter. I told him when I sat down here, I said, Governor, this is the closest I'm ever going to have to having your seat, so I'm going to use it for 45 minutes. Unlike me, he's qualified for the position. But, you know, he's all over it. And frankly, what he's doing is he is fighting a nonpartisan or bipartisan or multi-partisan group that is making the case to EPA, and in the frankly, it's the same vein or the same lesson when I embarrassed Ian before. You know, I mean it though. When I worked in headquarters, you know, when you're inside the Beltway, it's regulation is a one-size-fits-all opportunity. And people in the EPA regions, the states and the cities that I got to work with in the Western United States back in, you know, whenever that was, the 80s and 90s, impressed upon me how local solutions can meet a federal objective in a locally appropriate way. And that's really trimming it down to its barest essence. What I think Governor Ritter and his colleagues at the center and the governors, the 8 governors that he's working with, have so effectively put into place here. They've changed the dialogue of 111D being a one-size-fits-all regulation and have the door open to whatever that final regulation looks like. I think June 20, late June, early July, that we're looking at finalize. Having some different framework to it that allows for a Colorado approach, a Montana approach, a New Mexico approach, a Wyoming approach. And I just think it's fascinating. And one of the reasons I'm paying attention to it is it was back with this RAC hat on. We are going, you know, the RAC really develops the SIP, the State Implementation Plan, Colorado's demonstration to the Environmental Protection Agency that we have a plan to attain federal air quality standards for, in this case, ground level ozone. And it's all connected. The work that the Oil and Gas Commission has done with some regulatory measures affecting energy development, oil and gas production, certainly at the Air Quality Control Commission has legislated, has promulgated regulations, they fit, and 111D will as well. The Colorado's compliance with the regional haze standard, it all fits together. And what we will do at the RAC is figure out where we are with the new federal standard. It could be as low as 65 parts per billion as a maximum level of ozone particulate, of ozone levels in the air. Ozone, just to come away for just 1 second, don't want anyone to think we're talking about the Vice President Gore hole in the ozone layer ozone. This one's different. This is ground level ozone. It's just a substance that's cooked from hot temperatures, sunny summer days, and emissions of either VOCs or NOx in the air, which the heat combines and combusts into ground level ozone. It's a respiratory issue. It can have very, very dire consequences for asthmatics. And it's a real, you know, it is a real quality of life issue. It's something that appropriately is regulated. It's tough everywhere, and it's very tough in Colorado to attain these new standards. The new standard, if the new standard is going to be 65 parts per billion, and that's the indication of a range that we think EPA is going to settle on, just to put that into context, 65 parts per billion, the combination of background ozone in this state from coniferous forests, from evergreens, they emit these chemicals that are the precursors for ozone, as well as transport ozone, which comes literally from outside the borders of the United States, from the other side of the Pacific, and from, frankly, some of our neighbor states. Wyoming, California, and Utah combined give us 6 parts per million of VOC, of NOx, of ozone. And so that's 10% of our entire load right there. Another 35 to 40% comes from trees in China. So when we look at what we can work with in Colorado, there's not a lot of give there. So we, like 111D, to bring it back full circle, we will be looking at local solutions here, not something that worked in Boston or Sacramento, but that works in this community. And to repeat something I said before, I can't imagine a scenario where that's not a combination of voluntary measures and regulatory change and requirements.
Great, thanks. Okay, my last question, John, maybe if you could sort of put your civil society hat on and look at the same question I asked Elaine in terms of how these types of voluntary initiatives are viewed, the level of trust, the perception of integrity, the lack of enforceability, and both in the context of the climate talks that you've described, the Sustainable Development Goals, the discussions around those, but also down at community level, communities who are interacting with companies who've adopted these voluntary principles. Can you talk a little bit about the trust factor, the enforceability factor, the greenwashing fear?
Yeah, I've noticed a sort of an interesting kind of a trend. One of the things should probably also be clear about is I worked for a short time with ICMM as well, helped set up their climate change program a few years back. And I became a lot more engaged and sensitive because I was also asked to lead the ICMM delegation at the Rio +20 negotiations, which led to the post-2015. And so I operated under that with the broader Global Business Alliance. And we were one major group amongst 9 other major groups, including women's major group, NGOs, et cetera. And one of the things that I have found remarkable, because I also managed to do an awful lot of on-site touring when I was with ICMM, going to installations in South Africa, in Chile, in Brazil, etc. I found that on the ground level, the amount of and the dialogue that was going on and the real give and take in terms of developing voluntary initiatives and improving community relations was something very real, and that the civil society on the ground was increasingly recognizing. And that, in fact, within knowing how the company's social license, over the last 10, 15 years, and Elaine, you would be able to speak to this much more effectively than, of course, I could, but it struck me that it sort of started as almost a PR exercise, and that's where you got the greenwashing sort of stuff. It was part of corporate social responsibility. You would have a sustainability report, but it's now become much more and more part of the conversation on the bottom line because of the cost of delays, which are astronomical for companies like Newmont and Freeport and Anglo, et cetera. And there's been a real rising sensitivity and awareness to that. There's no question about that. What is interesting is that how it has not translated one iota at the multilateral level. And so that when I'm there as a representative of the extractives industry, International Council for Mining and Metals, et cetera, and I'm trying to carry on a dialogue at the multilateral level with the indigenous major group or the women's major group, there is still such an issue of legacy when it comes to the extractives industry that we haven't come even close to beginning a real dialogue yet at that level. And so when it comes to the multilateral negotiations, it's very, very lacking still. And an awful lot of work still has yet to be, and I think it'll build bottom up, but you're not seeing it translated yet at the at that higher level. If I might, I was fascinated, Andrew, by you're talking about, there isn't one size fits all. I'm very much sympathetic to that as well. The opposition leader in Canada, Justin Trudeau, has just developed has proposed a carbon pricing scheme that would take into account the provincial developments on each of those areas. Alberta is not Quebec, is not BC, etc. But the one rejoinder that we consistently get, and if you don't mind, Brett,
sure,
because Elaine, I'd be interested in your perspective. There's a concern that some have expressed that business would be saying, "Oh my God, that's the last thing we want." So that there's a pricing and a regulatory scheme for Montana, different from the one from Colorado, different from the one from, and so how does that affect your business reporting and compliance practices when every jurisdiction is going to have a different sort of set of rules for actually addressing some of these environmental issues?
You want me to answer?
Sure.
Well, we operate. I'm probably not fully qualified to give the definitive Newmont answer, but my instinctive answer would be that we already operate in multiple jurisdictions with different tax regimes and regulatory regimes and different requirements. And even in the U.S., where we have Newmont, by the way, is a gold mining company. I should have explained that probably. Where we have large operations in Nevada, but we also have things scattered around in other places, and we have to comply with state laws and regulations just as we do with federal laws and regulations. So I think we would adapt to that, and we would also recognize that there are these, sometimes the best solutions are more local and more sensitive to the realities of operating on the ground. And the risks are different too. The environmental impacts in California versus Connecticut or Nevada versus Wyoming or Montana may be different. So that may be a legitimate approach.
All right, let's open it up for questions. I see 3 or 4 hands already. We'll go this way. How about Steve? You want to go first, and then we'll go here?
Steve Desposito, Resolve. So I'm interested in the issue of kind of what's next. We were here 6 months, 9 months ago, and a woman from Pennsylvania stood up and talked about the issue of oil gas, Center for Sustainable Shale Development, which is a site-based certification initiative that they're piloting. I'm curious, Andrew, if you think something like that would be helpful in the context of Colorado or the West, where you start looking at what is best practice and piloting certification at some level. Now, on the mining issues, Elaine, I was interested in pointing to the cyanide code as a success story. For Don and Elaine, what's next? Is there something? Can that success be built upon? Is it by somehow extending the cyanide piece to something else? Is there another issue out there where some type of utility something that brings competitive advantage, addresses emerging risk, or solves common problems? Is there something in Newmont's mind or the ICMM's mind as to where to take that approach next?
The Pennsylvania site certification, it's an operator certification, or that the site is appropriate for the proposed activity?
Practices, are you doing certain techniques the right way, as I understand?
Right, so is the operator utilizing best practices? We haven't talked about that in that context in our state's oil and gas regulatory regime. What we have done, though, might get us to the same place. I should have done this before. How many in the room, if I may ask, live somewhere other than Colorado? I want to try to pepper this a little more nationally then. Okay, thank you, that's helpful. In our state, we really have seen a tremendous growth in oil and gas development. We have 50,000 plus or minus wells in operation today, oil or gas, in this state. And that's excluding federal lands. Every one of those is, including the second oldest oil well in the nation, is down in Florence, Colorado, still operating. What we've done in the past few years, though, is probably 4 major regulations. 3 are probably on point here. The first one was to require that any hydraulic fracturing operation, the operator, the hydraulic fracturing oil field services, gas field services worker, has to disclose every single chemical that's going downhole. That is on the website. Any one of you could pull it up right now on your laptops. It's on a website called fracfocus.org. We had discussions, candidly, this was all an open session, about whether the state should build a website or whether an existing website should be utilized. The regulations said, let's go with the existing website to get the information out to the public faster, and let's review it in a year or so. And if it's not getting the job done, if the public isn't getting the information that they deserve, they're entitled to, we'll build another website. So far, we are hearing from the public they're getting what they want. So anyone in this room could ascertain what's happening at a frac job near any property they're interested in, and what's going downhole, with one trade secret provision that is certified, like the federal trade secret provisions, under penalty of perjury, potential imprisonment, et cetera. So as Governor Hickenlooper says, we know the ingredients in a Coca-Cola, but not the formula or the combination. We do know the ingredients of what's going downhole here. That led us to a second important regulation, which I think is, frankly, another best practice. Every new frac job that's taken place since May of 2013, so it's in place almost 2 years now, requires groundwater sampling prior to hydraulic fracturing and post-completion. The obvious implication is, and that information is made available to the public at no charge on the web, on the internet. So the obvious implication there is an interested, I won't even say concerned, an interested citizen could find out what the water quality is as a baseline before a well is fracked, and immediately thereafter. And then again, frankly, months following that. We're pretty excited about that. That's both of those. I would say Colorado is at the forefront, and I'll also say, having been a part of those processes, they were very collaborative processes with industry, environmental conservation organizations, landowners, et cetera, being a part of that process, which I think always makes a better process. And then finally, we have setback regulation. Where the operation can take place has dramatically changed in the state in the past 2 years. We used to have 150-foot setbacks from residential buildings. We've more than tripled that by regulation to 500 feet. That's for a single-family home. For a high occupancy building, an apartment building, a hospital, a school, a corrections facility, a nursing care facility, 1,000 feet from the building to the operation. That's up from 350 feet. So tremendous change in what I guess the commission felt were the best practices, and if following those, one is then certified for operation.
And I want to make sure we get some other questions, but do you want to just take a quick?
Shorter answer, sorry.
No, it's good. But you want to,
sure.
The other side, just
I mean,
briefly?
one of the what would come next is, how do we, is there a way through a more formal process for good performers to get credit for good performance? How could Newmont be the gold supplier of choice, for example? So, how do you verify that? Because there are lots of things that go into good environmental and social performance and just managing cyanide well. And so what does that look like in terms of the supply chain? And, I hate to say the word certification, but, is there some kind of happy place that you could take the things that companies already do and standards they already do and formalize that and get more visibility and credit for that in some kind of a certification process? There are some fairly successful things like the Forest Stewardship Council and the Marine Stewardship Council that have these stamps of approval on companies that do things a certain way. There's the Responsible Jewelry Council that mining companies do participate in. So I think I don't know exactly what that would look like, but something like that down the pike eventually, I think, is where we would be a good place to go.
Great. You got a question?
Hi, my name is Ann Mace. I'm an independent consultant here in Boulder, Colorado, and also chief scientist for eTech International, which is a small NGO that does technical assistance mostly for indigenous communities in Latin America. I have a question. It's rather specific, and it's mostly addressed to Elaine, I think, but it touches on the topic of the symposium, which is bottom up, and some of the themes that others have addressed, like transparency, and that is, how willing do you think industry is to get involved in voluntary agreements with communities where they're mining or doing extractive industries that would provide funding for independent monitoring? And I'm not talking about participatory monitoring, which is what I was involved in a little bit in Yanacocha years ago, where they're just kind of observing the company monitor, but this would be independent monitoring where the control was with the community. They would decide what and when they were going to monitor, but it would be collaborative with the company, and there would be a lot of transparency with the results.
Well, I think a number of companies are already moving to do that, actually. And, you know, I think the participatory part is a good start, because often in these communities they don't have the capability to go out and do it themselves, or even the capacity to manage others that might do it on their behalf. And for them to be involved in understanding that, that's a good place to start. But I think if companies believe they are conducting themselves in the right way, managing both water quantity and quality, using water as an example, that would be something many companies would be willing to move toward or do if there's the capacity locally to manage that and set that up. And we do something that's like that in Ghana more than probably what we have ongoing in Peru like that now. But again, it's back to transparency and trust and different mechanisms to bridge that gap. And the best way usually to do that is for people to be part of solving the problem or understanding what's going on. So, conceptually, I don't have a problem with it at all. Of course, implementing that needs to be very specific to where you are and the requirements of that particular location. And I think it's always better if you start from the beginning with that approach rather than coming on after there are problems or you've already lost the trust of the community. If you go in from the beginning with that attitude, I think it's a lot easier to set it up and for things to be right.
There's so many sustainable development efforts going on right now, and I haven't really seen that as part of the sustainable development frameworks. So.
Great. Sir, did you have a question?
Yeah. My name is Rob Menzies. I think I've got it. I'm the chair of the Lafayette Clean Energy Stakeholders Group, and we're trying to get financing for people to get energy efficiency measures because the upfront cost is a big barrier for them. My question is about how this is going to interact. I hope that you have some visibility into Dumont Coal also, because this question has more to do with running out of D. And the idea is that with people doing more energy efficiency and demand management, we're cutting electric load, and that's softening the demand for coal and natural gas. I'm wondering, as we do that, and there's demand management, maybe it's 111D is going to create some decreases. We've got the soft prices, and that causes probably the payoff for energy efficiency. I'm also concerned about public finance of things like carbon sequestration, clean coal, Keystone, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the interplay between the changes in demand shape and so on and so forth, and economics of investing in keeping our old coal power plants alive, burning the fracked natural gas that we've got, and cutting the demand for all of those.
Well, I promised a shorter answer on my next question, but I'll start with yes. Demand side management is critical. It's essentially it's the equivalent of conservation on the water supply side, in my mind. Wearing my air planner hat for our region, including your community, and we have great participation from the North Front Range, the South Front Range, from local governments, from NGOs, people, frankly, far more qualified than me to help figure these policy issues out. We are always focused first on demand management, on transportation measures, on carpooling, on more efficient vehicles, changing out gas lawnmowers to electric lawnmowers, electric vehicles. We have, that's just a constant theme in the work we do. And the modeling and the projections we do to help figure out where our community will be in 3, 5, 10 years to ratchet down even further ozone production as we want to meet these new lower federal standards. That's always the starting point. And frankly, we've got data to show that that was the starting point 5 years ago, and we already know that between cleaner engines and more transportation measures, we're getting there. Fast Tracks is a pretty interesting thing. For those of you who are not from Colorado, we had a voter initiative at the ballot box 6, 7 years ago to actually come up with a multi-county supplemental share of a sales tax, dedicated revenue source to build out public transportation, light rail, heavy rail, bus, dedicated corridors, managed traffic lanes, bike lanes, electric vehicles, charging stations, infrastructure. And Fast Tracks is being built as we speak. And our air quality models don't even have the benefits of these new demand side measures and improvements in our air quality situation. So that's where we start. As long as I'm the chair, we're going to continue to do so, and that's the direction we've gotten from our governor. And I think, frankly, we see the benefits of it. We have a long way to go still, no question, but we're seeing progress, and I think we're going to see more when we do this, when Fast Tracks is built out.
Okay, we've got time for one more, hopefully simple question in the back, and then I want to give each of our panelists a chance to just make a final concluding comment. So
I'll try to keep my question simple then.
Yeah.
I'm Christy Disney, and I work with a Colorado-based nonprofit called Sustainable Development Strategies Group. And a lot of our work focuses on the long-term contributions that natural resource development can encourage. And a lot of our work focuses on mining. So Elaine may be best positioned to talk about this. But as John mentioned, voluntary initiatives are often gap fillers, filling a void. And I think this is particularly true with industry initiatives in mining that can go on for 30, 50 or more years. So we've been working quite a bit in recent years with governments and multi-stakeholder groups on ways that the benefits of mining, the programs that are initiated, the initiatives that are undertaken can be continued after the mine closes. So ICMM provides some guidance on that and integrated mine closure planning. And we've looked at community development agreements, foundations, but this remains a huge issue. How can some of these programs and the benefits they offer, how can voluntary initiatives continue? And I'd like to have any ideas you have on that point.
great. Maybe Elaine, you could take that and then also make your closing comment, and then John and Andy can make their closing comment.
Well, I think that's a fantastic thing to be working on, and it's beyond voluntary commitments. The issue of how can mining have a long-term positive impact on the communities where they operate is the fundamental question of sustainable development, really. If you are going into a place to extract a natural resource, how do you balance that economic opportunity and value for the company, that economic contribution to the local community as well as the regional community and the national community, with protecting the environment, with creating communities that have stability and have a standard of living that's worth having. And if you're even going to talk about sustainable mining, because the resource is there, you take it out, the question is that even a concept that you can talk about? I think it is, if you go in with the idea that in working in conjunction with the community and with other partners, that from the beginning you need to create a way for those benefits to carry on after that ore body is gone. And that happens by skills development and educational improvements and giving people the opportunity to work for a living and benefit their family and have skills that are transferable, that aren't specific to just the mining industry. It comes from that piece I mentioned briefly, the local content piece, in making sure that you are helping local people develop their own businesses, have the skills to run a business, to supply the services and the things that the mining industry may need, but that can grow beyond the mining industry and actually create other economic opportunities. And that's the vision that we've had for the last 15 years of how mining can do sustainable development where they operate. I think now people are thinking bigger than that and recognizing that model often isn't adequate because we do eventually go away. So how, from the beginning, can we have more robust partnership models that bring in other industries with us when we go into a place that might be undeveloped that can exist after we're gone? Or how do we partner better with government so that some of the improvements in infrastructure that mining companies often create are robust and continue in the right way after we go away? It doesn't do much good to build schools and medical clinics if the government isn't committed to staffing those and providing funding. And it comes back to this concept of transparency around the money. Where does the money go? Where do the taxes and royalties go? If they go somewhere far away into a national government and don't come back to the local community, then there is an increased likelihood that you won't have that sustainable solution that you're looking for. So maybe that is my closing comment.
Pretty good closing
around
comment.
Partnership and that long-term view.
Thanks. Andy, a quick closing comment from you.
Yes. I asked who wasn't who was visiting us in Colorado, and a bunch of you raised your hands. I didn't say welcome. Welcome to Colorado. Our friends and neighbors from the north and elsewhere. One of the things we do is and I'm a big proponent of. I probably came across today is learning from others. And I've been fortunate in my years back in public life and my years in private practice to work all across the country and abroad. And we really do. Some of the regulations I talked about today that the Colorado commissions have adopted, we gleaned, learned about, or cribbed from what some of you have in your home states have already done and accomplished. So learning from others is a very important part, I think, of a healthy regulatory climate. I think it's an overword used, but it really is appropriate. This is a balancing position. These are complex policy issues. I think to crib from a TV commercial, it's not your father's Oldsmobile or your mother's Oldsmobile anymore. There's a new way of doing things. There's new technologies. There's a lot of young, fascinating new minds, and there's a lot of people to learn from who have faced similar policy challenges and gotten there a different way. And I think the regulatory community not only recognizes that, but values it. Best practices can come from industry. Best practices can come from academic. Best practices can come from consulting practices who help to share experiences. They are welcomed, in my experience, by the regulators, whether I'm actually a proponent of a project as a developer's lawyer, or if I'm sitting with my regulatory hat on in my off time in my public life. Where I'll leave it is, I just can't, at the risk of stating the incredibly obvious, communication and participation are so vital to a good work product. I've really been impressed as a regulator in Colorado at how, by the time the difficult decisions are brought to the regulators, the people who vote up or down on these things, how much has been resolved by, let's just call them stakeholders with perhaps different views, by working together, by pushing, by listening. And I know that probably for every hour a regulatory body in Colorado hears and votes on something, my guess is for each of those 1 hours, there's probably 50 to 100 person hours behind it. And it shows, it makes a big difference, and I think, frankly, we're getting it right here as a result. So that just means the participation of all of you and the ideas those of you who don't live in Colorado bring to us. They're valued, they're welcomed, and they end up as the law, and they're helpful.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
John, you get the last word.
Thanks, Brett. I'm just struck by the fact of, and I was commenting on this last night as well, in this whole bottom-up approach, we are taking something massive we are assuming something absolutely massive. And we live in a bubble in North America. We live in societies that, in fact, allow for this kind of consultation, stakeholder engagement with industry, with governments. Way too many parts of the world do not allow for that, do not have the space for that, do not have the governance room for that. And that's where, in fact, the mining industry can and has played a rather interesting role and is looking to try and find space so that, in fact, they can develop these kind of community relationships. And so I was very interested in the response that you gave, Elaine, about how sustainability now needs to be seen beyond the strict confines of the mining operation itself. And that how, for it to be truly effective, you really need to develop much broader governance schemes that actually will extend the sustainability and the prosperity of the people who are the most affected with that. And then one last point I'd like to make, Brett, is Elaine, you began your comments by saying in terms of bottom-up and voluntary, and the first criteria you used is that it can enhance competitiveness. I think that there's a broader issue here that we've heard mentioned by people like Rifkin and McKinsey around a third industrial revolution that's at pace now. We talked, the first industrial revolution was about the mobilization of labor. The second one about the mobilization of capital. This one is very much about the mobilization of resources. It's not that we have oil peak or anything like that any longer, but getting to the resources is becoming increasingly difficult. The grades are becoming, smaller and smaller, the grade concentrations. So if you want to get that copper out, it's now at under 1%, whereas 15, 20 years ago, it would be at 10%. That has huge environmental implications. So it's not that we're shutting off the pipeline. You can't. But how can we do that much more effectively where the resources are actually sufficiently priced so that that really does enter into the decision making?
Great. Thanks, John. All right, well, let's please give a hand to these three very good panelists.